I wanted to welcome everybody here this morning. I'm so glad you're here. And I want to introduce the moderator for this panel, Hector Tobar. Hector is my new colleague in the literary journalism program at UCI. Yay!
Hey, Hector!
He's so great. And he also has an appointment in the Chicano and Latino Studies program here. So we're very glad to have him here. He's an illustrious novelist, wrote The Barbarian Nurseries, and he also wrote The 33 about the Chilean miners. That's a book of nonfiction. And we're just very proud and happy to have him here. Thanks so much, Hector, for doing this.
It's great to be here and to host these amazing writers for this panel, which is called Imagining Another America. We'll have something to say, I think, about the title in a bit, but it's first my job to introduce our panelists. And I'll start over on the far, our left, your right, with Wasu, who is a contributor at The New Yorker, is a staff writer there, a staff writer at The New Yorker, also author of A Floating Chinaman, Fantasy and Failure Across the Pacific. He's written for Artforum, The Atlantic also, Grantland, Slate, and The Wire. He's been in Best Music Writing and Best African American Essays. And also, he is currently an associate professor of English at Vassar College. Welcome, Wa, to Irvine. And just flew out from New York, yes. And we have Douglas Kearney, LA-based poet, performist, librettist, and teacher. He has an MFA from CalArts up in Santa Clarita Valley, yes. And traveled down here through several interchanges and zip codes and area codes to come down here. Yes, ecosystems. And he teaches African American studies there, yes, currently. And his first full-length collection of poetry is called Fearsome. It's available from Red Hand Press. And he has many other books, too, The Black Automaton and Buck Studies, yes. And he was a winner of the California Book Award. Those are cool, yes. Welcome, Douglas. And we have Cristina Garcia, who I first met when I was an MFA student here, and she was one of the visiting instructors when I was getting my MFA in fiction. She has written 7 novels and kept on writing since then. She's the author famously of several books, including Dreaming in Cuban, The Agüero Sisters, and Monkey Hunting. She's a winner of a Guggenheim and a Whiting Writers Award, and currently lives in Northern California. So welcome, Cristina. And finally here, Laila Lalami, who is the author of the novels Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, also Secret Sun, and The Moore's Account, which it doesn't say it in your bio, among other awards here. So you were longlisted for the Booker Prize, yes? Amazing achievement. And teaches at the university, also has won a Guggenheim and many other awards and accolades, but is currently a professor of creative writing, yes, at University of California, Riverside, our sister campus in the Inland Empire. So welcome, Laila. So I'm going to toss it over here to our distinguished panelists to make about 5 minutes or so of remarks here to begin riffing off of the topic of the conference, who do we think we are, an American identity. So Cristina, can you start for us, please?
I knew this was going to be a kind of informal, freewheeling situation. So I didn't prepare remarks, but I did jot down a few things, and I thought maybe before we could start talking about identity and the sort of state of affairs here in 2018, I wanted to concentrate for a moment, or at least make it part of the conversation, to talk about language, to talk about the sort of degradation, the debasement of our language and of political discourse, to describe the complexity of our lives, politically and otherwise. And I think this, devolution that we're seeing into sloganeering instead of complexity is affecting our ability to define the shape and significance of events, even describing ourselves. And I think it gets harder and harder to do when we're just perpetually entranced by the parade of visuals, social media, and so on. All of us are writers up here, novelists as well, and I think here making a pitch for our novel writing, is I feel that any good novel expands our ability to absorb and to analyze ambiguous situations and get inside the skin and intentions of others. This is something that we see much too little of in public discourse. Whether we're talking about identity or whether we're talking about Medicare, or whether we're talking about foreign affairs, etc. So I would like to just emphasize that I feel very strongly that abandoning specific crenellated language is abandoning freedom to a certain extent. Our language matters. And I think this collapsing, this flattening of language, this two-dimensionalizing of language makes us more vulnerable to tyranny. Makes us more vulnerable. I think when you renounce the difference between what you want to hear, these slogans that we get hypnotized by, and what's actually the case, we're lambs to slaughter here in so many ways. Maybe just a couple of other notes, and then I'll just keep handing it over to the others. I do think in many ways our reality or language has been. Our language has been eclipsed by the reality of our identities, the realities, plural, of our situation, and has become largely, at least in public discourse, inadequate to the task. I also think that with all of this siloization or zero sum, if it's good for them, it has to be bad for us mentality, is preventing us from forging allegiances with people we don't get along with on everything, And so I think that also creates insularity and is dangerous. Some years ago, my father and I used to talk every night. This was the first election. He's extremely right-wing, Cuban exile, 80-something-year-old, and we would fight every night just as sort of part of our day. And he'd always end the conversation with, "Well, okay, good night, Cristina. I love you very much. It's always good to know what the enemy thinks." I'm like, "Yeah, you too, Dad. All right, good night." And so to be able to have these conversations, familially, extra familially, whatever, is so crucial. I'm thinking, if you think historically, even for the 16 months that the Solidarity movement actually thrived in Poland, those 16 months, it thrived before it was shut down, of course, but it thrived because people from all walks of life forged alliances and allegiances and found common language, complicated language to accommodate them all. It was not an ideology of exclusion, but one of inclusion. And so that's my what I would like to make part of this conversation is this importance of language, the importance of language to capture the complexities of our lives, and the necessity for cross-pollination and fervent inclusion.
Thank you very much, Cristina. And now can we move to what?
Sure. First of all, it's really great to be here. I spent a couple years of my life, like 15 minutes away from here, and it's awesome to be back. So I just want to talk a bit about, I guess my work is primarily as a cultural critic, so I spend most of my time listening to records and watching movies, retweeting memes, and sort of thinking about sort of the larger structures that hold these things up. And thinking about this conference, I was sort of taken back to the summer of 2008. I'd been assigned by The Atlantic to write this piece called The End of White America. They just gave me the title. There was no sense of what I was supposed to write. But the editor, who was actually on the opposite sort of political side as I was, said, regardless of what happens during the election, American culture, popular culture, has made a turn over the past decade. And we see a lot of the signs of that in this current Obama campaign. So my assignment was just to go and sort of like scour the culture and figure out the different signs and markers for that. And I ended up writing about sort of all of these different ways in which people in advertising or marketing or academia or just sort of everyday life were engaging with this shifting center, right? People were no longer assimilating toward the same core as they may have been when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. So it was a piece about Dora the Explorer or the fact that Diddy walks around with the Declaration of Independence at his annual July 4th parties. It was about the different ways in which like an immigrant assimilates towards sort of different ideals or different visions of America. And one of the interesting things that I think didn't come across in my piece, or that I didn't really understand at the time, which is sort of the ferocity of not just the backlash against the president, Obama, but also the backlash against that sort of culture of kind of diverse images or of diverse possibilities. It was one of the really surprising things, I think, of the past 8 years is the resurgence of this sort of culture war mentality, this idea of going back to this idea of like siloization and the fact that if there's a female Ghostbuster, that means like all of our memories of male Ghostbusters are somehow like erased. But this larger backlash, I think, that's cultural has been really fascinating and I think sort of troubling to me as a cultural critic because I think I always assumed that there were, in my minds, righteous ways to interpret culture, right? There are ways in which if you understood what the singer was trying to say, if you understood what the movie was trying to convey, you would have politics like whatever I have. But one of the interesting things about the last election cycle was just that there's a very rich world of cultural criticism that comes to the opposite conclusion of things than me, and it's not just about sort of the people being represented, but I'm thinking of, if you're familiar with the John Cameron film They Live, or the controversies around how people interpret the Matrix movies. There's all sorts of ways in which these symbols and structures that I interpret one way, another person can intellectually interpret with an opposite political outcome. And I don't think either of us are right or wrong. I mean, in the case of They Live, John Cameron said that's actually the polar opposite of what I intended. But I just think it's forced me as an individual, as a cultural critic, to think about my relationship to culture, what I expect from it. I got in this Twitter beef with Martin Shkreli, the pharma bro.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the interesting things about it was that he and I love a lot of the same music. And I don't doubt that he loves the same music. I just think it's interesting that we draw something like radically different from this music. And so I think one of the things I've tried to think about more is just this space of ambiguity and how culture helps us work through those spaces. Just larger questions of whether it's possible to imagine identity, imagine the nation, imagine politics sort of outside of the marketplace, outside of the structures that sort of produce and deliver these things to us, and just whether there are sort of these cultural markers or expressions that present different models of things that we assume to be dichotomies, right? Like you either assimilate or you don't. It's not really how life works. And I think I've become more drawn to just thinking through instances that don't necessarily just like flatter my pre-existing politics, but just destabilize them and sort of reckon with ambiguity, I guess. I don't know how long that was. All right.
And now we'll move to Doug Kearney.
As everyone has said, we had sort of loose remarks, but I also am so excited by what Cristina and Wa have already said that I want to use some of my time to think about those in live. But a couple of things that I was thinking about is when we begin to imagine the America that is, one of the things that Hector pointed out is that we're also imagining the America that is already polyglot, it's already multivalent, it's already this, I don't want to use any of the sort of celebratory language of melting pot syllables, whatever, but it's already this destabilized space. And a lot of times, I oftentimes will use musical metaphors, and I oftentimes think of like a mixing board, how you adjust sound and different frequencies in an individual track. And it feels to me like certain moments in culture are just one dial being pushed up and another dial being pushed back. It doesn't actually disappear. It's just what we're paying attention to. If we think about the early teens of the early half of this decade, the frequency of conversation around Black people being murdered by police. One view, if you don't remember that this is a mixing board, is that, oh, it just started happening again, as opposed to just kind of going like, oh, look, we can, in the language of our kind of common exchange, we can trend it. To the conversation around the sort of simplification and flattening of language. What happens with a hashtag? What happens with resist, which doesn't tell us to resist what?
Yeah, right.
It's just resist. There's an automatic assumption that if I put resist, you're thinking the same resistance that I am, as opposed to just sort of like, yeah, just like everybody just don't do whatever's happening. So that's one thing I was thinking about in terms of early in the email. What's been happening? What's already happening? And how do we, within our points of attention, within the poetic impulse to make associative connections, within the writerly impulse to draw conclusions, within the essayistic impulse, within the teacherly impulse to say, here is a narrative that we're going to create, how does that silence other parts for the convenience of resonance? How does that resonation actually drown out other sound? The question of assimilation versus cultural preservation sent me to an essay by Coco Fusco from the mid-90s, I think it was. And I think it was called Who's Doing the Twist? Everybody's Doing the Twist. And this essay is definitely of its time. But one of the things that I think of as interesting is that Fusco is calling for a new vocabulary around questions of appropriation. That the argument that Coco Fusco is trying to make is that if a subaltern, so it's very 90s, right? A subaltern group appropriates from a dominant group, that's very different from a dominant group appropriating from the subaltern, right? This, I think, slant rhymes with the notion of satire as the difference between punching down and punching up, right? That's already a kind of a marketplace, sort of a politicized conversation around power. But where this draws to me to the question of assimilation versus cultural preservation is that as a part of this, and remember, we're in the 90s with this, Coco Fusco has to take on essentialism, right? Which by now we kind of easily kind of go like, oh, essentially, no. But Coco Fusco is arguing that essentialism makes sense as a logical strategy when somebody's shit keeps getting taken. Which is to say that you have to then say, well, that's the counterfeit shit, this is the real shit. Which puts it back into the conversation about the marketplace. How are we figuring what it is that we make, what it is that we are, when so much of our identities have become commodified and have become disproportionately profitable within that marketplace space. So the question of disengaging from that, when at some level the only truth that a person believes they have is their authenticity. And I say believes they have quite intentionally, right? That this performance of an essence of who we are, in direct relationship to this spectrum of assimilation versus cultural preservation. Again, it's never 100%. There's always this sort of dialing and there's always this sort of adjustment. And finally, I would like to say, and I think it was Hortense Spillers who said this, that for people of color, the world ends every day. So in terms of the question of a normative experience, what changed at the point of the election, the last election? Different groups have different strategies for reckoning that change. Different groups felt different layers of betrayal. Different groups felt suddenly in crosshairs that hadn't perhaps felt them before. And so the question is, what can we actually learn from each other in the space of this ambiguity? If we assume that everybody here is a member of some kind of super team that brings a special talent to the conversation, the space of ambiguity is the one space where we can begin to say, like, well, maybe my talent isn't the only one, but it is also a space in which we can begin to wipe out the possibility of understanding what each person brings to that space. That space of destabilization means we either grapple onto each other to try to hold on, or we each try to hold on to one thing on our own, or we grapple onto each other and some of us fall together. That destabilization, I think, is one of the sources of the great anxiety, but it's also the source of great possibility. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. And now finally, we'll move here to Laila. Lalami.
Thanks very much, Hector. And thank you all for being here. So the panel is called Imagining Another America, and I thought what I might do is talk about each of these three concepts. So what I thought I might do is break up the three words that are the title of this panel, Imagining Another America. So when we talk about imagination, I happen to be a novelist, and I just wrote a couple of years ago a book that was called The Moor's Account. And it tells the story of a black Berber Muslim slave who was brought to America in 1527 and was part of an expedition that failed, but that is memorable because the people who survived it ended up being the first outsiders to cross North America, and they landed in Florida, but by the time they were found, nearly 8 years later, they were near what is now El Paso in Texas. And that incredible journey was chronicled by one of the survivors, a man by the name of Cabeza de Vaca. And in it, so he tells us what happened in the expedition and the sort of indigenous tribes that they met, and it's full of ethnological detail, his account. But what was interesting to me and what drew me to the story was that the one man whose testimony was not recorded in the official record was this man whose name is, in my book, I call him Mustafa Ezzamuri. In the Spanish record, he's known as Estebanico. And so the book came out in 2014, and as I started speaking about it to audiences, I was just struck by the fact that so few people had heard of this story, and how much of what Americans know about their own country is made up of erasures. Just as this man was erased from the historical record, the way in which Americans imagine their identity is made up of a huge number of such erasures. And that spoke to me because as an immigrant myself, and as a Muslim, and as a woman of color, all I have to do to see that erasure is open up the New York Times every day, open up the LA Times every day. There is nothing new in that. So that's what I wanted to, is that all I wanted to say? Yes. So by erasure, what I mean is that most people understand the subject of exploration as being the province of white men, when in fact, as you can hear from the story, it was not just made up of white men. That the expedition itself was mostly white men. In fact, there were women, and there were people from different parts of Europe. There were indentured servants, there were slaves. It was very much a multicultural enterprise, even if it ended up benefiting the Spaniards. And that conquest itself is understood to be the exercise of power by the Spaniards towards indigenous people, and it makes indigenous people seem like they are silent witnesses to their own subjugation, when in fact, when you look at the story more closely, you realize that they were not. Sometimes they resisted, sometimes they collaborated, and in the end they survived. So those are sort of some of the myths that I explore in the book, but basically what I came away from working on it is how much of that imagination is made of erasure. The second word is another America. And here I want to talk about the fact that identity, when we talk about identity, we talk about the self. But the self is a sort of a relative term. You cannot define the self without defining the other. I'm a woman because there is such a thing as a man. So we define the self in terms of boundaries, and what ends up happening, unfortunately, is in defining identities, whether they be racial or sexual or national, whatever identities they are, we're sort of delimiting boundaries, and people unfortunately sometimes make them into these rigid boundaries. And so then you have the sort of retreat where you can only be one thing and not the other, when the reality is that all of us are multiple things at the same time every day. And we sort of negotiate different identities in different moments of every day. So for example, my being on this panel is likely I've been invited because I happen to be an immigrant and I happen to be a writer, right? And so those are the two identities that I'm sort of using right now to speak. And then I'm going to go home and be a mom, and I'm going to have to deal with the cat and the kid and all of that stuff that's going on. That was an interesting order. Okay, so... the cat is the master of the house, so you can... So that's about the sort of the self and the other and the word another, and I wanted to sort of bring that up. And then the last word is America, and I think that with regard to that word, I think it's so interesting that we have these discussions about national identity, and this brings me back to my original word when I talked about erasure, when the true American identity, the original American identity is, of course, indigenous identity, and all other identities ought to be hyphenated from that point, but of course we don't. The only, as Toni Morrison so famously said, the only people who need to hyphenate their identities are non-whites. So I just wanted to just bring up a few of these thoughts and stop right there and refer to our fearless leader.
Well, yeah, I think in thinking about American identity, I mean, I think that's something that sort of informs almost everything that I've done in my practice as a writer, back even starting when I was at a community newspaper. I was 24 years old, is unpacking this idea of what it means to be American and what this society is. And I think when I think of American identity, I think back to my own childhood growing up in Little Armenia in Hollywood, which was then an extremely polyglot place. I had Czech friends, Filipino, Armenian, Lebanese. But we were all sort of, I remember like one of the great moments of my childhood was that I was asked to lead my class in the Gettysburg Address. And I think that my desire to become a writer was born in that moment, you know, memorizing the Gettysburg Address, which is this beautiful civic poem. And so my generation, you know, we grew up with this very obviously whitewashed notion of what American identity was, as beautiful as the Gettysburg Address is, and as really beautiful the version of American history I was taught. It is now different, you know, and I think over the course of my lifetime, I've seen how gradually this sense of what American identity is has shifted and has added, new layers have been added to it. And I think the first bullets to penetrate that wall, the first cannonballs to knock down that wall of whiteness around American identity for me as a kid was African American history, because African American history was the first thing that sort of incorporated into the public schools after the Civil Rights Movement. And then getting older and reading and seeing these erasures that Laila's talking about, I can remember moments when my vision of what America was shifted dramatically, American history, in things that are very small details, but also sort of stood for me for big shifts in my understanding of what America is. And one was reading Edwin Burroughs and Mike Wallace's great history of New York, Gotham. It's like this thick. It's an incredible history of New York. And there was New York history, even in the 16th century, the 17th century, was so incredibly complex and diverse. He describes communities of poor white indentured servants living alongside free blacks on the edges of New York, you know, in the 17th century. And that whole book is filled with just so many different ethnic groups and nationalities. So from its very beginning, you see that New York is this diverse place. And with the second largest city in the United States, one of my favorite books about Los Angeles is The Los Angeles Plaza by the USC historian William Estrada, where he paints a picture of Olvera Street and the surrounding streets around the center of Los Angeles, where Los Angeles was founded. And it's this incredible cast of characters. Japanese communists married to, you know, white Jewish women, Emma Goldman, French parades, lynchings, Chinese massacre, all take place in the center of Los Angeles. And so from its very founding, Los Angeles was this meeting place. And so today when I sort of teach parts of this to my students in Latino studies, part of what I'm teaching them is this diversity of experience that is even part of the Latino experience. And a lot of it is new to them, but other parts of it aren't, I mean, they live in another country. They live in a country where they have an understanding of what it means to be American that isn't just from textbooks, it's from their life. And so that's my question to you is, do you feel this notion of American identity is shifting at that sort of grassroots level among what young people consume where they live? I mean, even when I was in Oregon, which is one of the whitest states in the United States, Portland is the whitest major city in the United States. I mean, people had a sense of cultural diversity, of what it meant to be, what was cool. And so that's my question. My first question to the panel is to sort of respond to that. Yes.
Yeah. Because it really actually connects to something that you were saying earlier, Laila, that primary erasure, right, of First Nations folks. I think that the notion of what America is, again, is kind of an advertising sort of a thought, is shifting, partially in response to nativism and xenophobia, which is this narrative of immigrants, country of immigrants. There is I think it's a product you can buy from one of the progressive democratic fundraiser types of things. It says, we're all immigrants. And I said, no, that's bullshit. No, we're not, because there are a whole bunch of people, right, who were not immigrants. And they were erased to make space for immigrants. And then there's this other thing, right? There's immigrants as a kind of idea of leaving a bad situation to go to a better situation. Also call bullshit on that. There's there's some people in this room who that's not a part of why we're here, right? Hamilton, as storied and celebrated is, the biggest line in that whole thing is when they go, immigrants, we get the job done. Everybody goes, yeah, right? Right? So if there is a shift in that notion, right, I think that we're dialing up this particular narrative, this particular history. That is going to come at a cost, right? And I think that idea, I don't think that it is untrue, that is a huge part of our history. But if we say that is what we are, then we are erasing quite a lot of people. And one of those groups happens to get erased every time. The First Nations, they get erased every time, except when we need a sports team or a military weapon. That's pretty much it. Right. Also SUVs. And SUVs, exactly. Right. So I think that there is this narrative, and at one level, I think it's important because there has been a huge response against that idea, right? But I do think that in the making of that narrative, if we don't nuance it, if we don't account for it, then we are going to be just performing another erasure.
I think it's more than selective amnesia. It seems like sort of the erasure is not just oversight; it's deliberate, and it's trying to forge a cohesive narrative when it's actually quite a complicated and fragmented narrative. And I think maybe the lull that maybe we were operating under, I don't know if the lull is the wrong word, but there was a kind of sense of inevitability of progress, of things that are going to get better. Yes, we went through this, civil rights and Vietnam War and the Pentagon Papers, it just felt, with a few backslides that we were still moving in the right direction. This feels radically different now. And we almost have to go back to history to see why. You think, okay, well, when did democracies flourish? I'm thinking in Europe, exactly. It seems more the exception than the rule. There was a flurry after World War I, and then we saw what the 30s and 40s wrought, right? And the same after World War II, but a lot of those fragile democracies didn't last. And I think that us taking for granted the inevitability, of politics, cultural and otherwise, to progress is something that we cannot afford. The flip side of that is also this notion of, this halcyon past. Excuse me, whose halcyon past was this, right? Even that phrase, America First, do you know how it was originally used? Yeah, it was a committee by Americans who were against fighting Hitler. America First. That was the name of that committee. Charles Lindbergh was a big proponent of that. So Make America Great Again, excuse me, back. And interestingly enough, when these phrases are used, they hark back to the 30s, a period of terrible, repression, economic collapse. In fact, I think I'm not going to quote him correctly, so forgive me, but Trump said something like, yeah, we should go back to the 30s and everything should be run aground and start all over. Thanks a lot. So there's this notion too of some mythic past that bears very little resemblance to the realities of how people actually lived and the sufferings and privations that were endured at that time. So I think we have to be very mindful of history and not take, so-called progress for granted, and that includes cultural diversity and everything else.
When we're faced with sort of this nativist discourse that we're getting, that we're awash in right now, that's where the temptation to say, oh, we're all a nation of immigrants. It's because he's saying that. And so that's why we can't sort of engage, like that's already a mistake. If he's saying America First and the answer is we're all immigrants, then we all lose, because the whole point is to say that reality is more complicated. And so engaging with nativist discourse by sort of pushing these erasures is the wrong impulse. Yeah.
I think this question definitely cuts to one of the kind of philosophical complications of how I view my work nowadays. And I want to go back to your moment of, I'm sure it was a series of moments, but there was that moment that I think someone like, I'm 40, and I remember a moment when I sat in a college lecture and my mind was blown, right? Like instantly everything changed. And I think that idea of there being this epiphany that suddenly you realize that the America that I've been sold is not sort of in reality what it is. I think that we have to sort of go back to this question when we want to talk about imagining another America, of like what the inputs are for one's imagination. And I think mine were pretty modest compared to the average 18, 17, 14-year-old today, right? Like I built a palace out of whatever magazines I could find, whatever books I could find, like what the local library could provide. I didn't really have access to the kinds of information that the typical, that most humans have today, right? And so it was really important to get to that college lecture when someone told me about the Chinese Exclusion Act, or I took like African American Studies class. Things like that were meaningful in a very different way that I think are difficult to reproduce now, especially for people of color. And I think that's one of the things that I have a hard time grappling with just in my work, because one of the things that I've noticed a lot since it's been happening sort of since the 70s, but it's really sort of taken on this accentuated turn since Obama's election, was just how the sort of trappings of whatever we want to call identity politics has really drifted from sort of this is what people of color do to this is how sort of white Americans see themselves as well. And so a lot of those transformative moments now are happening on the right, and in circles that I don't necessarily identify with, but when you don't have that sort of one textbook that everyone's reading, then all of a sudden sort of all bets are off in terms of like what the transformative spark becomes. And I think that that's a really difficult thing for us to deal with, because I think for all of us, everyone in this room, like we're just trying to figure out how to truly engage, right? Like how to cut through the static and the noise. And like I'm on social media as much as like my students are, and what actually gets across, what gets through, how to sort of have these conversations with this nuance, it's increasingly difficult when everyone has like a platform, you know, like I don't miss the days of there only being the one textbook to sort of position myself against, but when I was in high school and I saw this book, I don't know if anyone remembers this book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. I mean, that was a I'm sorry if I can't swear. That was a very, very meaningful experience, right? And I think I've had, like, I teach first-year students who walk into college with a far more sophisticated, more access to a wider range of ideas, maybe not as sort of deep of an engagement with a single idea, but no shots at my students. I just mean like they just have more, and I think they have a different way of engaging with it. Whereas like you, I found the one thing, and I'm like, I just need to like see where this goes, you know, so.
Yes.
I was going to say something about, but I forgot who said this. Oh, I think it was Hua, about in relation to what's happening on the right. I think what we're seeing, and this actually also ties up to the sloganeering that you brought up when we started out. Part of the reason that makes Trump's nativist talk so seductive, I think, is because there is no language right now for white people in America to talk about their race outside of the language of white power. There's just no way for them to talk about it, because the way in which they have been taught race is that race is something that belongs to people like us. It does not belong. Race for them is the absence of race. And so when Trump comes along and says, you're a victim and you're, illegal aliens steal your jobs and bad hombres are coming from across the borders and we need a complete and total shutdown of this and chain migration and this and that and the other thing, it's basically making of them a special class that is a victimized class, which is how they have been taught to view other races, that these are minorities, and that they have suffered, and that's why they are minorities and they're special classes and they're protected. And now this guy comes along and says, you too are a protected class, you too are a victim, but it happens to be couched in this language of nativism. And I think that the big challenge now is how to get white people to talk about their culture and their race outside of the trappings of white power. And that's a huge challenge, because there just is no language. It would require fundamentally rethinking how we teach American history in the schools. Like, everything has to be retaught, and I just don't think that the country is prepared to face this right now. We're still sort of trapped in this idea that race belongs to people who are not white. So that's the challenge.
Matt?
Yes, please.
Earlier to the idea of the 30s and that nostalgia, Thelma Golden and Cristina Y. Kim came up with a term that I think is useful now. In this case, it's called non-nostalgia. And it's a nostalgic desire for not only a time that may or may not have existed, but a time you never experienced.
Right.
And so that flattening that we're talking about, you get to just pull the best parts from it. And it becomes a kind of syncretization, right? And I think that syncretism is something that I was thinking about when you were talking about two people can look at the same work of art or, cultural artifact and come away with it with different thoughts, which, not to make everything about instrumentalization, but those thoughts are also things that are going to be used. So things that are going to be used two different ways. And so I think there's something syncretic that happens when we're dealing with nostalgia that I think is interesting. And that language that we're talking about, like going back to what's already happening, in some ways, I've been trying to think through, it started off in thinking through the notions of political correctness, right? That the first call for political correctness was actually in the service of white people. I don't want to see a black person kiss a white person. That's politically incorrect. So we are going to prevent that from happening. Identity politics, if we go back to Britain at the early time of the transatlantic slave trade, there had to be something done to specify as to why British people and other Europeans who were accepted in that scope would not be considered the same thing as these black people. And so never, never, never be a slave. That is identity politics. Like I don't feel like we made that. I feel like identity politics is another thing we inherit. So I think that looking for that language is perhaps, tracing back to that originary space. What had to happen to create white people, right? The notion of whiteness. Yeah, because white people don't exist, right? Any more than black people. Like the notion of a white people had to be structured, constructed. So I think in looking for that language, a place potentially to start, and I think you're absolutely right, that work, we don't want to look 3 weeks ago, let alone several hundred years ago. But I think that if there are people who are interested in looking at that language, what was the language what was the original, the early blueprint? I won't say the original. What were some of the early blueprints? And so I wonder about these terms that we talk about as belonging to people on this panel, and how often that kind of erasure around what PC was first, what identity politics were first. And so that in the theme of some of the writings that we've submitted is a kind of a provocation. I tend to think through making provocations at myself and my students. So I hope that's not irresponsible, but that's just something I'm just thinking about.
Well, one thing to me that I taught in Oregon, so I was in a very, it wasn't as diverse as this here, to put it politely. But there was an incredible amount of diversity of class. And I remember, I was dealing with a lot of people who were, white kids, that term, whatever it means, white kids, who were really, broken from small towns that had undergone this incredible economic shock. And I remember I wrote a piece for the New York Times, this is before the election, about I felt like I had something to teach them about resistance. Like my people, Latino immigrants, Guatemalan immigrants, I have this cultural capital, which has allowed my family and people like me to survive. We've survived. It's like, I want to give this to you. And there was a really, a very strong response among the, 10 or 15 people in Eugene who read it. But I thought, that's something that, I think this is a flow that can go both ways. Now, someone mentioned, works that sort of speak to whiteness. Well, one really popular book that came out recently, I read most of it, is Hillbilly Elegy. Yes. Which, is about class. It's about class. I was a little distraught when I found out that the author was considering running for Senate on the GOP ticket in Ohio. That kind of really took the wind out of my sails. But so there is this growing notion of let's discuss class as this sort of unifying force, and I'm hoping, as a former Trotskyist, that will happen one day. But the other thing that I deal with every day is just this notion that I want to create art. We all create art, we all write about art, we all write about things of beauty. And it just feels like, and especially as a person of color, it just feels so, I'm writing this novel that's set in the 60s and 70s, and there are days where I just feel like this is like the world is falling apart. And here I am trying to create this beautiful paragraph, describing some place that no longer exists. And it just, how do we deal with, especially as writers of color, with living in this time where so much is expected of us, demanded of us. We have voices, we have access to all of these different tribunes, whether it be a publishing house or a newspaper or a magazine. The world is falling apart. But yet we want to create things of beauty, and that requires ambiguity. And how do we deal with that as writers of color? Is my question, to you. Big one.
That's a big topic, but I might just say write until the hurting sings. Yeah. And then sing some more.
All I have to say about that is I hear you. I struggle with this every day. Do I get on the phone with Dianne Feinstein again, or do I, work on this column, or do I finish this, start on the nonfiction book, or what do I do? It's crazy. But I do think it's important to imagine, because this is the space in which we are free. And until we can imagine ourselves free, how are we going to get to that place of freedom? So I don't know, I as hard as it is, it's something that I try to do every day. I do try to work on the novel every day, yeah.
I try to decentralize myself a little bit, which is to say I don't presume that I am going to be the person to do the thing. That maybe the thing that I write, and we've seen this countless times, right? The thing that I write makes somebody whose skill set, whose energy, whose all of that is inclined to doing other kinds of things that I might be able to do or find myself, able to do. Tracy K. Smith once wrote, she wants her poetry to do things her vote can't do, and vice versa, right? I mean, like, a poem is not a vote, but that doesn't mean it doesn't do something. And so I think that part of it for me has just been sort of like being, I don't know, I mean, if there's some kind of like heroic narrative that, a person might be inclined to put their life in the middle, I'm just trying to be like, okay, I need to be the person who goes like, here, I got your back and do this. And that's something that my work can do. And then there will be times where, as writers, you will be on a panel someplace or at a reading someplace where there will be a moment where you have to choose whether you are going to fight in that moment or, get cheese and wine afterwards comfortably. And that's a space that somebody else might not find themselves in. So I guess I'm leery of ever kind of going this or that. And, there's the old saying, writing is fighting. I mean, like, recording, imagining that future, witnessing now, all of these different things that make it possible for somebody in 30 or 40 years or 100 years to look back and go, oh, this is the same. This is what happened. Like, if we don't write it, then it can be erased in a different sort of way. So, or we don't say it. It doesn't have to be writing some kind of utterance that can stick. But yeah, I feel that same tension a lot. And maybe it's just a rationale, but I do think that it matters.
Oh, if I could jump in go ahead. No, I was just going to say that I think writing is a form of activism, sentence by sentence. And ages ago, when I was a journalist with Amy, I went down to cover the elections in Peru, and Mario Vargas Llosa was running for president. And I remember following him around and interviewing him, and he was an extremely stilted public speaker. He was just not really suited for. At all. I mean, it did not surprise me that he lost horrendously. But at one moment in a conversation, I said, well, how do you, I was asking him about the language and how he switches from that common denominator speechifying that he was doing with the subtleties and intricacies of his other writing, of his novels in particular. And he said, and he basically said, you try, with the public discourse, you try to become the blank screen that everyone can project their own wants and longings upon, some version of that. But the part that I do remember very distinctly was that, but with novels, he said, you're seducing one person at a time. And I don't think we should underestimate the power of that seduction and the ripple effect of that seduction, those seductions. The idea of two sensibilities engaged over time is a very specific, unreproducible thing. And I think we need to value that and the unseen ripples that it can cause. Yeah.
So I definitely feel like I probably write the least beautiful sentences of anyone on this panel, and I think that in a weird way, I've thought about this a lot recently. Since the election, I've actually tried to write even less beautifully. I'm not sure why, but I think immediately after the election, if you were online a lot, I mean, the New Yorker was just churning out stuff like hourly, and I think a lot of it was I mean, I thought a lot of it was really good. And I just remember just staying up all night for like a few nights, just like writing stuff. And then the editor's like, all right, we're going to post this. And it was very cathartic, actually, because I wrote a piece on like listening to music, like, and getting drunk the night of the election. And I wrote another piece about normalization. It was very much just, I want a marker selfishly to remind myself how I felt these 2 days, right? And I think after that, I sort of stopped wanting my voice to lead my work. Not that I've felt that that's sort of how I write, but I think I've tried to embrace the kind of the humble sort of ripple effect of writing more, because it was such a wild week at the magazine. Like the internet traffic was like off the charts that week, because everyone was just craving content, right? And things that sort of could articulate feelings that they had. And I think that's ultimately what a writer can do, is just articulate something that words that, or I'm not doing a very good job right now, find words for things that other people may not have the time or energy to find words for. And it's had this weird effect on how I've written since then. I mean, I think I write a lot of cultural criticism, and I think I've become more comfortable inserting my kind of initial, just my own personal reaction to something. But my reaction to things can be very ambiguous. And so I think I find myself actually writing myself into my work more, but not in a way where I want you to kind of like admire my depth or whatever. More just sort of like I am just sort of a vessel for you, the reader. I don't know what the hell is going on either. And this is just another moment when I'm reminded of that. And I do think about it because, especially as a contemporary writer who's on the internet, there is that sort of sensation of something doing really well in the moment. Yeah. But I keep having to remember that that shit doesn't matter, like it's really about whether someone 10, 15 years from now can read something and think like, this is how people in their time thought about these things. I mean, I remember I had a piece due on 9/11, and it was for a British magazine, and my editor was like, really sorry about what's happening, but your piece is late. You have to write this today. And it was kind of terrible, but I'm also really glad that, like, that's sort of the selfish part of being a writer, is that you can sort of leave these indelible marks, and it's just part of some sort of larger record. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask one last question and have you all respond to it, and then hopefully it's not as big as the last one. And then I'll open up for questions to the audience. Yes, we'll get questions from the audience. Yeah, just one last question, which is, and maybe this can be a shorter answer, but I think that all of us have become writers to fill vacuums that we felt existed in the culture. We had things to say that other people weren't saying, right? And I know that that's one of the reasons why I became a writer, was just I just felt like my city wasn't being represented, especially the Spanish-speaking part of my city wasn't being represented. And when I think of my practice now, I think like what my goal is to fill this notion. I think that the Latino working man, Latino working woman, as a working man and working woman, is not really, there's not really that sort of kick-ass character story that I want to, in American literature. Especially celebrating the rhythms of work, daily work. That's my own personal goal, is to create a work of art that speaks to the power, in a non-sentimental way, that speaks to the power of Mexican-American, Guatemalan-American people in the city and how they've built LA, the LA that I know. So my question to you is there, not just for yourselves, but in general, what you see in the culture, is there, in writing about this America that we know, that is different from the one that is often represented in different forms of media, is there that vacuum, that thing that you want to see filled, or something that you'd like to create that, or imagine someone else creating, that really would help, that would address some of these issues of sort of seeing the country as it really is?
That was me going wow and about to say, yeah, smaller question. Yeah, and I also just wanted to amplify the fact that somewhere in answering the last question, you're the question of class got lost in the sauce. And I think that that's another kind of erasure that attends a lot of these kinds of conversations. And I'm not saying anybody was like, yeah, I don't want to talk about that, but I think that's important to keep in mind. And it was one of the questions that Hector put, that Amy and Hector made sure were a part of our considerations. How can we imagine anything possible without economic justice? And I do feel like that's one thing we haven't necessarily talked about. So please know that that's a consideration of what the panel was directed to. But if it didn't happen, it's not because it wasn't a part of the content. I think that the question of do I see things missing, why I became a writer. I mean, I became a writer because I like playing with words. I became a published writer because I thought something was missing. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Because I could write whenever I want to write. That's not. And now it's easier to be a public/published writer. There's virtually no negative for publishing online and online journals. So I tell my students all the time, you can't love being published, you can't love finishing the text, you have to love writing. But to be published, I think that there's that sort of space. And I guess I'm just really interested in conversations around language. To me, always find their way to Afro-diasporic practices of signifying. The question of ambivalence and ambiguity, to me, is a constant cultural project that the Afro-diaspora has been working on. And there is stuff there that if other people don't just take it and try to sell it, they can actually learn from. Wow. Around navigating moments of ambiguity, around navigating a destabilized sense of who you are, that it doesn't necessarily require you to thrash out like a wounded animal just because you don't know who you are. And so I think that is not missing, but it is something that I can add to so that anybody who likes things that quote hip hop lyrics can go like, oh, I see that there. Hip hop is doing it too. I mean, like, not all of it is doing it in a beautiful way that we would like, but it's doing it. And on the question of writing, I can't tell you how, and its relationship to movement and activism, I can't tell you how many rallies, how many bits of video have shown people at rallies chanting the lyrics to a multi-million-dollar funded record of popular music, Kendrick Lamar's All Right. They're singing that chant at this. So, like, the question of does our writing affect this? what movement hasn't had a song? Right? So, I mean, like, anyway, so I don't see that it's missing. I just see that there's a way that I can amplify it in my sense. And that one of the things that I am grappling with right now as I deal with questions of what it means to be Black middle class, what it means to be a striver, what it means to have made it, what does that say to me about class? How does that change my sense of accomplishment, my sense of comfort? Like, and if I think, gosh, it feels weird being a Black middle class person, and I feel like, how do I move that from a personal unsettling destabilization to an actual action that's not just about the idea that this is the promised land, which just says, we got to keep this going, but let's just get as many people into this as possible, but perhaps rethinking how we feel amongst each other. What is stability outside of being able to buy stuff whenever you want it? And so if I didn't answer that question, it's because I am in like the middle of trying to think through that like right now. And that's where I am with it, but I went far long, sorry.
Yeah, super interesting. Well, I grew up the daughter of Cuban. They would call themselves exiles, and so all of my father's family came to the U.S. With my mother, and then all of my mother's family stayed behind in Cuba by choice. So I grew up, and I was taken off the island when I was 3. And so I grew up just under the shouting match that went on for decades, either shouting match or silence, this deafening silences that went on for decades. And I just kept getting the debris the debris kept falling on me all those years, and it wasn't until I went back to Cuba in the 80s for the first time and then made repeated visits that I got to know that whole clan and how incredibly binary that situation was, and how in essence they were flip sides of each other. The intransigence, the reliance on again, I'm going back to the political sloganeering, this with us or against us mentality, and I was quite determined by that point. I was a journalist to not fall into that trap. I mean, first I was completely inculcated in one, and then I was utterly swayed by the other. And then I think one has to make one's own way. But what I did become fascinated in, and I think in book after book, it's something that I do look at, which is what is the fallout from big historical events, cataclysms, seizures, seismic events. What is the fallout on the everyday, on the quotidian, on the relationships between people, on what happens to families, on how we live our lives, and whether it was, the Dreaming Cuban, looking at the rupture and of what the Cuban Revolution wrought on Cubans and the Cuban diaspora, but even my most recent book called Here in Berlin, it also does that in terms of World War II and how the fallout continues, and from 35 different perspectives. And so for me, I don't think we could ever lose sight of the little H histories, of the quotidian, of our dailiness, of those rituals and self-rescues that happen upon waking and through the course of the day. And that's what I'm interested in, that continual navigations of self. I don't think this notion of, I think this notion of identity is, for me, is not a fixed, you were alluding to that, Laila, that it's not fixed. We are in constant negotiation with self and other and others. And so I think that's what I'm interested in, and there is no, there's no shortage of material for that, because history keeps marching on.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people who do things that are creative are trying to fill some void, right? But I think more specifically, for some reason, the reason I asked about the question is because instinctively I just pulled up this quote that I find really meaningful. And it's a quote that I didn't read when I was younger, but it sort of filled in some sense of why I do the things I do. And it's from the Jamaican cultural critic Stuart Hall. And he was talking to an interviewer who presumably was white. And he was talking about Wordsworth's poem Daffodils. And Hall says, "In the back of my head are things that can't be in the back of your head. That part of me comes from plantation when you owned me. I was brought up to understand you. I read your literature. I knew daffodils by heart before I knew the name of a Jamaican flower. You don't lose that, it becomes stronger." And I think when I read that, I very much recognized, not obviously the place he was coming from, but just that sense of creating and writing and art as not necessarily a form of malevolent revenge, but as a way of just sort of nurturing it sort of explained why I've felt like I had a chip on my shoulder as a kid, and I think at a very basic level, there are all sorts of voices that I think are not sort of adequately represented in the publishing landscape. I can only speak for myself in that I think one of the reasons I wrote or became a writer, I have a very specific reason, but the broader reason is just because, as a kid, seeing people make fun of your parents' English makes you want to be like really dope at English, you know? So I think that was really part of it, was just being told, or I mean, and I'm sure I was the one sort of making fun of their English at times when I was really young, but I think having that sensibility of, I'm here now, I have a different life than you, I need to master these things that I think you've mastered, but clearly you haven't mastered them sufficiently, and I will carry this forward. So.
I'm going to keep this really brief. I'm sure everybody's really tired. I was just going to say that when I was growing up, my very first exposures to literature was by seeing other people who looked completely different from me in these books. So I grew up reading French literature. So you think Astérix and Obélix and Boulébile and all of those people, Nos ancêtres les Gaulois, all of that. And that's how I grew up, and that's what I read when I was growing up. There was never a single Moroccan to be seen in any of these books or to be read about. And it wasn't until I was, I would say, in middle school that I really was exposed to Moroccan writers. So this is not an unusual experience. This is what everybody who comes from a culture that's been colonized by another has experienced. And similar things are happening in this country, even though the word colonize is not being used. But there are young people who are growing up not seeing themselves in these books. And what happened for me is that I became a writer very simply because I loved to read and I wanted to tell stories. The urge to tell stories is what drove me to become a writer. But like Douglas said, the reason that I became a published writer was because there came a point where I really felt like I wanted to share these stories with other people, because I had felt so alienated from the material that I was reading when I was growing up. And I thought maybe other people might want to read the kinds of stories that I had to tell. And so that's why I became a published writer.
Well, thank you to our panelists. And now we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We have 10 or 15 minutes left. Yes, I have a question right there.
This is such a tough question. So I'm a columnist for The Nation magazine, and you can imagine what the readership of The Nation magazine is like. Okay, so I remember I posted whatever the last column that I wrote was on my Facebook page, and somebody shared it with their Facebook page, and one of the comments was, well, of course, you know, completely dismissing without reading the piece, whatever it was I had to say. That's what somebody from The Nation would say. And it really stayed with me, because there was not even any attempt to read what I had to say, but it really is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Like, how can we, as writers, and the responsibility that we have to try and reach people sort of above the sloganeering that Cristina talked about. So to just give you a very quick, and this is what we're up against, just so you know, this is why the question of language matters so much. Do you all remember that sketch that Saturday Night Live did about Ivanka Trump, and she's played by Scarlett Johansson, yes. And the whole complicit perfume. Okay. So everybody had a good laugh. It was funny. This was last March. Well, last month, Donald Trump came up with an ad for his re-election campaign. Yes, already. And the ad features an undocumented immigrant who was accused of committing a double homicide. And the ad said, Donald Trump is trying to stop illegal immigration. He's trying to build a wall, but Democrats are, wait for it, complicit with, you know, people who murder. So he's taking the word that the Saturday Night Live used and completely turning it around and providing a completely different definition of it. And so now that word is, you can't use it anymore in a column. You can't do anything with it, because now it means two things to two completely different audiences. So when you're writing, that's the kind of word you would want to avoid, because it's just going to trigger people to have certain reactions. So I just feel like the biggest challenge when writing with audiences is like being so watchful with our language and how we talk about these issues. Otherwise, we're not going to reach anyone. And that's difficult because some of it is built in. I write for a magazine that I know what my audience is. Like, I'm not likely to reach anybody who's watching Fox News, and that's just the reality of who I'm writing for. So it is a challenge.
Anybody else want to answer that? Or no? So we'll go to another question over here. Yes?
Well, I'm not sure yet how I'm going to answer this, but my feeling is already that it's not necessarily just them out there on the streets of Charlottesville. I mean, our own government has privatized violence. Look at our prison system. Our own government uses words like terrorism and extremism when there's really nothing of the sort going on. What is extremism anyway? I mean, it's not a religion. It's just a way of calling out something that isn't mainstream or considered mainstream in the moment. So I think we have to be extremely watchful about language and even words like complicit or whatever, and actually wrest them back, and not let others define language for us. I refuse to say alt-right, although I just did. But I refuse the euphemisms. I refuse. I refuse the violent language to describe things that are just politically expedient, for the moment. I think if we give up our language, as I said earlier, we give up our freedom for this false sense of safety. We will end up neither free nor safe if we continue, on this path.
And I mean, in terms of thinking about resting back, there's also the question of resting back to where? To where, yeah. Because if we rest it back to us, we've lost. Do you see, like right now, we are in a room, and many of the people in the room believe we have the right idea. Well, guess what? The same thing is happening in another room. I'm not trying to make an equivalency, but what I'm saying is that if we presume that it is ours to dictate how it is used, we are doing something with language which is not what it is supposed to be done. Understanding what these terms mean and where they come from gives us more power over that language. Tracking when it moves into this discourse is just as valuable as saying, see, this is when they started using complicit. It's more valuable to me to hear you say the moment when complicit became a part of Trump's discourse. Because now if I think of complicit, I can now say, when Trump uses it, this is what he means. I'm not gonna say, well, I can't use that word anymore. Like, I can't give away my shit because somebody else is using it. I mean, you see what I'm saying? So here it is. So like, if we don't account for the moment when it became a dodgy word for us to use, that goes back to one of the first words we started bringing up. There's that moment of erasure. Whereas this amplifies how it is being utilized, which allows us to look at the motivations behind why it was happening. And now we can better counter that. Because I'm not gonna say it's not the word, but the word is a tool of intent. And if we imagine that it's the word, and that if we pull back complicit or do this sort of thing, we are just as potential to abuse that because we've now imagined that the tool shakes itself. And so I guess what I'm saying is it's not like talking about the language of violence, to me, is about talking about how the language is used. As a writer, if I am communicating something that is violent, at one level, I think that the idea of using, as was said, a metaphor or something like that is actually more problematic.
But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that because I think like, for example, if you think about how he's used the words, I'm sorry for speaking so much, but if you think about the word, like, for example, chain migration, let's say that you say, okay, we have to wrest that word. I had a whole Twitter debate with somebody about this because they were saying, oh, we should explain what chain migration means, which is a scholarly term. It was used by, people who study migration, but it's a very specific meaning and not at all the meaning that Trump is using it for, and we should explain it to people. Fair enough, explain where chain migration comes from. But if this is a term that the lay person just doesn't know, And now it's been introduced into the discourse, and chain, of course, has connotations of shackles and fetters, and it's used in a very political way. When what he's trying to do is to stop family reunification and to change immigration policy, and in order to do that, he needs to introduce a term that has nothing to do with it into. So he's muddying the waters. So if we say we have to wrest that term back from him, which I understand the impulse, but what I'm saying is, then we're letting him define that this is the sort of the parameters of the discourse, when we have a perfectly valid term that is already in our discourse, that is already what the policy reflects, which is that a person can sponsor a family member to come here. So it's very I don't think that there's one answer. Like, I think about this all the time because of the fact that I have to write these columns, which is such a headache, because you have to figure out ways to reach people, but at the same time you have to speak truthfully. So it's just it's complicated.
One other thing. Sorry. Go ahead.
Did you want to add something?
Just one quick thing. I think that at times it seems like the language is the only terrain for some of these contests, and I think that if you were in Charlottesville and someone was bearing down on you, language will do very little in that moment. But I think that it's important to think about sort of the ripple effect of these things. I think on the other side of the complicit example, and something that I've been really fascinated with, is when I was in graduate school, I never could have imagined that the language of white supremacy as something meaning more than just a guy with a hood on, right? As a system of oppression, right? As a structure. That's pretty mainstream now. You have a lot of people throughout different stratas of sort of experience, backgrounds. People are comfortable using that term vaguely correctly now in a way that is really eye-opening to me. So I'm really fascinated with what Douglas was saying. When do terms come into vogue? When do the indeterminacy of those words shift? And I think white supremacy is one which, for some reason, it's a pretty academic term that more people feel comfortable using because it's so descriptive. It's actually very descriptive. So that's just an example that I think comes from a different political.
One more question, and this gentleman here.
Well, there's the whole concept of code switching, which I think many of us do, almost on autopilot. I don't go into Versailles restaurant in Miami on Little Havana on Calle Ocho and think, oh, I will speak Spanish now, or I will speak Spanglish with someone who I know doesn't speak Spanish but likes to engage in the sort of the courtesies, which happened a lot in New Mexico, for example. I mean, you just start getting a feel for the terrain, where you're at, whom you're with, and sort of language follows. So I think one has to be ultimately, flexible about those kinds of arrangements, and also confront things when they are. When you're, say, in a position of in a way of privilege, of hearing things that people don't realize that, if they knew who you were, they wouldn't be saying them, And so, be alert to those opportunities too. I mean, it certainly happens to me fairly enough. But anyway, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. Anyone else?
As a poet, there's always the assumption that what I'm writing is autobiographical, that the performance of persona at any level of writing, whether it is more overt through traditional fiction or essayistic, we're always bringing certain performances to bear. So I think that you can write in such a way that's acknowledging what you're drawing from, but I think that there is the potential for that kind of understanding to happen through certain moments of authorial presence, I guess you could say.
Just one last thing. I mean, I think the only thing that actually maintains my sense of like hope or faith is that whatever it is that we can hopefully move toward in an upward trajectory it just evades language right now. And when I hear a piece of music, when I hear a sort of cacophony out of which harmony builds, like it's something that it's painful and difficult to describe, but it's sort of in that effort that, you can touch something intangible. And I think what we hope this imagination that we're talking about is like heading towards something that hopefully, like in our most humble moments, like it's something that we can only hope to touch with language. And I think that's the only thing that sort of allows me to continue working at all or writing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's fine.
Well, thank you all for
Otherwise
joining
it'll be
us.
another 10
And
minutes.
it is also
It's going to be another 10 minutes.
performance. Thank you very much.